Welcome to day 3 of the 8th annual State of Our Children Address and Report Card Release. I'm Evan Dawson. I'm the host of Connections on WXXI. Today's conversation on racism and education is championed by ESL Federal Credit Union. Now, you can be sure to join the conversation on Twitter. Just use the hashtag SOOC2020. It stands for State of Our Children 2020. And want to mention that, we've been having these conversations for a long time, and I am thrilled to be asked to be part of this because you're going to meet the panelists in just a moment. They've been doing work in this community in various regards for a long time, and too many communities across this country are hurting and struggling and dealing with entrenched racism, systemic racism, poverty, and its effects. And these are the kinds of guests that can answer questions that help us measure what's working, what's actually changing. Those are the conversations that I love to be a part of because it gets beyond just platitudes and it helps us see the problems that we have, how to climb those mountains, and frankly, how well we're doing with it. So we're going to bring them in just a moment. The theme for this year is equity and education, the next horizon. And there's no theme more relevant, of course, as we've experienced unrest in our community related to the death of Daniel Prude, the death of 2 teenagers on Pennsylvania Avenue, the growing rates of COVID-19 infections, which frankly, we all know there are inequities there and in healthcare, all while students are trying their best to mostly learn remotely. In this year's report, it's available on rockthefuture.org. The efforts to lift equity are all over it, and that includes Rock the Future statement on race, equity, and education, and the endorsement of the Black Agenda Group's declaration, Racism as a Public Health Crisis. The devastation the pandemic has had on the Black community only exacerbated inequitable outcomes experienced by Black people nationwide. However, we know these outcomes aren't new. We know the history of our country. Well, frankly, we're learning it maybe better than ever before and more extensively. Racism and its effects on health have plagued the Black community since slavery began 401 years ago, and we're seeing its effects in the education system. You've probably heard of Nikole Hannah-Jones doing such important work. She's a New York Times writer. She spoke during Strive Together's 2020 Cradle to Career Network convening. And she said the following, quote, "You cannot fix systems if you don't understand how they were architected in the first place. You can't just ignore some of the past simply because it was uncomfortable," end quote. The romanticized patriotic history prevalent across our education system often downplays the anti-Blackness, the racial apartheid, the racial terror experienced by Black Americans. And that leaves many of us, including students, without the shared language to talk about why we've gotten to where we are on race in this country. Now, if you have questions or comments related to the topic, we invite you to join the conversation. Drop your questions in the comment section right here. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Once again, the hashtag is SOOC2020 for State of Our Children 2020. Joining us for today's conversation, I'll welcome them now. Jackie Campbell is the Rock the Future Alliance Director. And we see you now. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Evan.
They're doing such good jobs muting and unmuting. It's like we're in this rhythm. So there's Jackie. Wade Norwood, Common Ground Health Chief Executive Officer and experience with Regents and so much work on education and health in our community. Hi, Wade.
Pleasure to be with you and with our guests, Evan.
You got it. And Dr. Leslie Myers-Small is the Rochester City School District Superintendent. Dr. Myers-Small, always good to see you.
It's my pleasure, Evan, and good afternoon, Wade and Jackie.
Well, I was just talking to all 3 of the guests separately, and I want to start here. I think of my education. I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland, very much like Pittsford. I mentioned, I don't know that I heard the word redlining until I was almost 30 years old. It definitely did not come up in any curriculum. And despite some of the narrative that education is, sort of left wing, or however the paradigm is, the reality is it's pretty whitewashed. It was for me, just looking at objectively. And so when you think about what Nikole Hannah-Jones says, and when you think about the 1619 Project, and when you think about looking at education holistically and taking in the Black experience and being honest about that, here's my concern. I'll start with Wade on this. My concern is if the Pittsfords of the world, and I don't mean to signal out any district, but let's take Pittsford, wealthy, mostly white districts Like I grew up in Westlake, Ohio. That's an example. If those districts aren't learning about 1619, if they are sticking with education and the paradigm that's been set, meanwhile, Rochester or Cleveland or Austin or any school district that's in a more of an urban setting focuses in on that. My concern, Wade, is you end up with mostly white students who grow up, they haven't heard these terms, and they think, well, why are we radicalizing education in America's cities? Why are we teaching it? Why don't we love America the way we learned in our suburbs? And you get almost this two-pronged system, and that worries me, and I want to know what you think about that first, Wade.
Evan, I would say that's not a hypothetical or a future state. That's the present state. Because of the fact that as a nation, we tend to leave decisions about curriculum up to local communities. The way in which the textbook industry has evolved in the course of the 20th century is that school districts choose textbooks that convey content that they want conveyed. And as a result, students around this nation get very different lessons on American history. That 1619 and that settlement is all about Virginia Dare and the brave pioneers and patriots who landed at Jamestown. That the Civil War was a war of northern aggression or a conflict around states' rights. Those are differences that set the context for public discourse that are already pre-existing, already baked in, and tend to be self-reinforcing because of that concern that you raised of whether or not, if we teach that even prior to its founding, white supremacy was a prevailing notion among the colonists. And as a result, the very Constitution itself was written with provisions that are in direct conflict with Jefferson's preamble of holding these truths of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to be common to all men, granted by the Creator. Why thinkers such as I find it inconceivable to be a constitutional originalist? Simply because the 3/5 compromise exists in the Constitution's original language. Those things exist, and I think what we're looking for, and I absolutely know what the speaker spoke to at that conference, was a discrete understanding of history is the only way that we are able to abide by Santayana's warning. And sadly, what we see today is that folks who are not remembering the lessons of history are seeking to repeat it, as recently as what we saw in Michigan with regard to the votes in Wayne County just last night.
Absolutely right. Dr. Myers-Small, when we look at this paradigm, I mean, you're doing your part in the district, and we're going to talk about that over the next hour. But do you share Wade's view that this is already happening? We've got essentially two views of American history being taught a lot, largely on racial lines, and that is a problem in this country.
Absolutely. So, Evan, I did grow up in the Pittsford Central School District. I attended school from second grade through graduation. And I remember every school year when February would come up, I'd approach that month with two kind of sets of feelings. One, finally, I get an opportunity to at least hear about where I came from, my ancestors. But the other part of me said, but this is sadly the only time that I'm going to hear about that. And my teacher is going to shift that responsibility onto me. And he or she is not going to teach that to me, that I actually became the teacher during that time from second grade all the way up through high school. And so when you think about if my parents had not been actively involved in teaching me at home and exposing me to cultural events or other activities or other individuals, I would have such a narrow view of who I am and my classmates. So, you know, the Pittsford Central School District, great school district, and some of my classmates have gone on to do incredible things. But some of them, unless their families took that time, we have senators, we have CEOs of organizations, etc. You don't get that accurate portrayal of history. And so not only was that certainly helpful to be reaffirming to me, but it helps to really shift that narrative that Wade spoke to, right? If we only know history and what happened from 1619 on, we think that Black people started in 1619, and there's a very defined singular narrative about what that looks like, and it ignores the history. If you fast forward to March and April and May of 2020, and what not only happened with the George Floyd situation, but what happened right here in Rochester, our young people are right alongside the adults who are marching and rallying and protesting and crying out. So if we think that our children, whether Black or brown or white or other, are not interested in this, we are sadly mistaken. We have really a moral and an ethical responsibility to make sure that we are incorporating this information, and that we're telling all sides of the story and not from a singular point.
Jackie Campbell, can you weigh in on this as well? I mean, do you see any progress in this? I mean, to Wade's point, you can look at Wayne County, Michigan yesterday. You can look in the last 5 years at the textbook companies, which are largely based in Texas, not always, but there's American textbooks. One textbook that was sending history lessons to students across the country referred to enslaved people as laborers. You know, just the euphemism, the way that we sort of have made ourselves try to feel better as sort of when the white textbook writers. Do you see progress here, or do you feel that that this is pretty entrenched, Jackie?
So I see progress, and I do think it's entrenched. I will say that I'm not from the United States, so when we first moved to the United States, it was interesting that I can look back on it now and say it was interesting where we moved to live. Like, we moved into the Black section of Rochester, not knowing that there was a Black section. So the whole term around redlining and where when we moved here, where you could actually live, it's all spelled out now. It's clearer now. I didn't learn redlining until recently, right? Along with everyone else. But it is, the school that I went to was right around the corner from where I actually live now. We still very much live in segregated ways. What I learned about Black history, African-American history, and just global history, much of what I learned that's accurate, I learned outside of school, right? Or outside of formal education systems. So yeah, it's entrenched, and that we have access to way more information now than we've had in the past. And scholars for Indigenous, for Black folk, for Latinos, everyone is actually looking at the truth. We have more access to that now. So I do think that it's not it won't be a question of what happens in one school district versus what happens in another. But I do think that we have supremacist systems that are going to fight to hold certain things in place. And it's going to take all of us, or those of us who actually know better, to really demand to know the truth. When I have talked to my colleagues, especially my white colleagues who are just finding out information, they're sort of like, nobody ever told me this. And for many of us, we've had to find out on our own. So this is something that really needs to happen for everyone.
So let me do this here. I want to read a little bit more of what Nikole Hannah-Jones said, because to Jackie's point, Dr. Myers-Small, it's one thing to think that, and Jackie, you can remute, by the way, just for a moment, just so we don't hear the dissonance. That's okay. We're all getting used to this. You know, Dr. Myers-Small, it's one thing to think, well, the system needs work. We can work on it slowly, improve it. It's another to think, no, this is how it was designed. And Nikole Hannah-Jones has said, quote, in a country built on racial caste, we must confront the fact that schools are not broken. They are operating as designed, end quote. How does a district operate in a system that seems to be operating as it was intended, so to speak? And what can you do about that, Dr. Myers-Small?
Sure, I appreciate that question, Evan. And Jackie and Wade know Hanif very well, and we had a conversation recently, and he said, "Leslie, I'm thrilled you're the superintendent." He said, and one of the things that you're going to have to continue to think about and push is that we keep on trying to fill in and put a Band-Aid and fix and address the system. We just have to create a whole new system, right? And so, I thought about that and I said, he's absolutely right. We keep on trying to put a square peg into a round hole and try to fix it up or pretty it up. And so what does creating a whole new system look like? I'm thrilled to have a great relationship with both Regent Wade Norwood and Vice Chancellor Brown and Regent Young. Those are the decision makers with the Board of Regents, right? And so if you're thinking about creating new systems, you certainly can work to create those at the local level, but in order for students to graduate or meet or exceed standards, they have to be approved, they have to be endorsed. So as long as you can show that there's something either comparable that meets or exceeds what those current expectations are, and I was so excited that the State Education Department pre-COVID was looking at graduation requirements, for example. So we're looking at that, and we believe that there are ways that our scholars can show that they know things, right? But that it's not a matter of, because it has been created in this very singular frame and from a particular narrative, the way we ask questions, lots of work has gone into looking at the way that the way questions are posed, right? And it's just not using the vernacular nor the experiences of our students. So as we look to create new systems, we have to work with those folks who can actually help us change the system. We can put it together, but we need to present it to someone who's going to say, yes, this has merit, this has value, and this alternative is not less than, but it is going to move your students in the right direction. And so that's what we're trying to do. Let me just give you an example. You're familiar with advanced placement and the coursework, right? That's some of the highest level coursework that students can take while they're still in high school. There is an AP biology course, there's an AP European history course, there's AP literature and language, but there is no AP African and African American studies course. At the end of September, the Rochester City School District wrote a letter to the College Board talking about our demographics, talking about the need, embedding some of the things, the concepts of the 1619 project, saying, here's a district that serves over 50% students who are Black and almost 30% who are Brown. And we need a course that is rigorous, that grants college credit, that our students can see themselves in. And that letter, Evan, has started to gain local attention. So the New York State Council or the Monroe County Council of School Superintendents have endorsed it. Monroe County School Boards Association. Now, the New York State Council of School Superintendents has endorsed it, and the Black school educators at the national level. We are saying that we have to change the narrative, that the coursework that's advanced is not enough and that we need to see that reflective. So you have to push it and try and create new systems that are going to really be reflective of what you want to see and not just go with what is the norm. And we don't want to see this embedded into other coursework. We want a brand new course.
Okay, well, so this is interesting because I want to turn to Wade and ask Wade to put the Regents hat on for a moment, because what Dr. Myers-Small is talking about is, taking the control that she has as a superintendent, listening to feedback, making these changes. And yeah, I took AP Euro when I was 17 years old. There wasn't an AP African Studies, you're right. When we think about just a week from now, what do most students get taught about Thanksgiving? How much, the indigenous peoples were so happy to see, those white settlers, and they just had a great meal together. It's pretty amazing. Some students are being taught that Indians lived long ago, as opposed to understanding indigenous peoples today. And so I think, Wade, there's a movement towards embracing more of the truth about American history, but how do you do that sort of, when there's all these different standards? And I'm going to kick this to you with a question from one of the viewers right now. Robert sent this. Education was local right from Horace Mann. Is that something that needs to be changed if we're going to make things better? Are we talking about keeping local control and just asking schools to do better? Or do we need centralization? Thank you, Robert. Wade, go ahead.
So let me start by saying that I think that the greatest surprise, disappointment, and challenge that I found in my service as a member of the New York State Board of Regents is localism. And the fact that the regents do not have the authority to impose curriculum on local communities. The decisions are made by local boards, and I don't think that as a public, and certainly I have been barnstorming to say I do not believe as citizens of Rochester that we have fulfilled our civic duty of really establishing a robust, engaging curriculum that prepares children, particularly children who live in poverty, for engagement with the 21st century. And I don't believe this is a new thing. I think it's been going on for decades. And that is the very reason why the Supreme Court in 1954 could, in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, call for desegregation of public schools with all deliberate speed. And half of the public would think, hooray, because they think of the first definition of deliberate being resulting from careful and thorough consideration, without recognizing that the alternate definition of the word deliberate is slow and unhurried. It is only through education that we can engage in the public life of this democracy. And what we are doing by our slavish devotion to localism, by thinking that the best government is the one closest to the people, is we are reinforcing and we are concretizing the residential caste system that is American communities. The American apartheid has a real implication on children. And so my advice would be, and it's why I am engaged not only as a regent, but as the CEO of Common Ground Health, is that healthcare is just as personal and just as localized as education. It is the delivery of a highly valued, necessary, intangible product and service through a highly professional workforce. And it has the ability to be just as two-tiered as education. But in our community, we have a decades-long history of saying we are going to deal with healthcare from a regional perspective. We are not going to treat it as a zero-sum game, that if you get better healthcare, it comes at my expense. We are not going to act as if disease states like the coronavirus have the ability to stop at town or city boundaries or county borders. And we form, and that's what Common Ground Health is, a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectorial conversation about how do we improve regional health outcomes for everyone. And I dare say that's the conversation we need to be having in education. I think that Kara Finnegan is an absolute asset. And the recent work that she did with, I think it's Professor Holm, her co-author, Striving in Common, is exactly the argument for why are we not thinking about this differently, and how do we allow a conversation that can recognize not only the rightful desire of localism by my suburban neighbors, but also the rightful desire for localism that I have as a city resident. I don't want my schools in my neighborhood operating in a way that I feel is at the control or mercy of people who live 15 minutes away from me. But doggone it, we have demonstrated, we have already succeeded in finding ways in which we respect local input while not allowing it to be an excuse or carte blanche for the rest of the community to sit on its hands and do nothing, while the least among us, the most vulnerable, the last and the lost, suffer more.
I'm going to kick it to Jackie in a second, but Dr. Meyer-Small, anything you want to add from the superintendent's hat? Agree, disagree with what you just heard?
I totally agree. I think it gets frustrating, right? When you have decisions that are being made and it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Rochester has amazing and unique qualities, but when we're talking about what we're going to teach our children, it is very difficult when you constantly, I just have to reiterate, constantly not see yourself reflected in that curriculum and in that content. And you're just hearing stories about how you were in a deficit mode, that you were enslaved, that you were feeble, right? That is demoralizing. And I remember, Evan, it wasn't until I went to college here locally at the University of Rochester that I had my first teacher. It was a professor, an African-American professor. It was in the African-American Studies department, and learning really from a different perspective, one that really resonated with me about the African and African-American experience. That's why, we fight so hard and we're working to say, listen, here are the needs. Our students can do it. They are brilliant, they're engaged, but they have to connect better to the content. And so we're trying to really figure out ways that we can make that happen. Dr. Nelms has done some amazing work at East High School, and we're working on some things to not just have it appear in social studies, which is very natural for us to do this work, but there are ways that you can reflect your content into science and to mathematics, to English, etc. And we have to start doing a better job of that. And, I think about that being a member of the Conference of the Big Five. The 5 largest school districts serve over 1 million students in New York. And so we should be able to have some influence with that and what happens.
Let me turn to Jackie Campbell. And Jackie, Rock the Future has made a commitment to equity in a lot of different sort of spheres here. And I want to ask you how you see the community engaging in the work to prioritize equity in different spheres of influence, because I would even say 5-10 years ago, there was a lot less talk about how to do that and what that looked like in practice. How much are you seeing equity centered in the way you want, and how does that happen? And tell me about Rock the Future's thoughts on that.
Well, one, I would say that we began late last year really asking a different set of questions about what we were actually seeing. And the tendency is to have conversations around how sort of outcomes or how people are ending up, instead of really having conversations about the system that is producing the outcome that we're seeing. And so we just really started pulling back, not just at one system, because we also have a tendency to do that as well. We think about education, and the school district is responsible for education, but we understand that we have a larger community. Like, we're all responsible for education, and education happens in schools as well as out in the community. So we've really been trying to lift our collective understanding of how those things happen, but also the responsibility. So Wade mentioned the health community, and we've just had a very dynamic set of providers from the Department of Pediatrics at Golisano Children's Hospital, as well as Rochester Regional, sort of leaning in a very different way about how the medical community supports children and families as well, recognizing that it's not one system, it is that we are a system of a community system. And so there are ways that we can actually look at the outcomes, but that should also help us to see what's actually happening. So one of the things that we've done this year in our State of the Children report card is really look across the system. And one example of that is looking at high school graduation. And so we always have a conversation about district schools and charter schools and state rates and so on. And what we find is that in the city school district, there's a lot of variation in terms of what is happening in schools. So you have some high schools that their outcomes exceed the state rate. And you have some where they are very low. And we have a similar set of outcomes when we look at charter schools. Like, not all charter schools are sort of batting it out of the park. So what we want to be able to do is sort of look what is happening in those places that are really excelling, and can we bring some equity to other places where there's that need. And so, and having those conversations about what's happening in school as well as what's happening out of school, and how those other areas impact where our kids are. We do have students and families that have significant challenges, and we should be supporting those students in terms of those needs. And can we look at how we are doing that in ways that are equitable, as opposed to putting it all in one particular space. So there's just, if you read our report card, there's a lot that we can actually do. The question that we ask is when we think of literacy, is that a human right? And is education a human right? And absolutely it is, right? So what is our responsibility in making sure that our students and their families have what they need?
So can I just piggyback on that? Because it's really, when you look at the report card, and it was shared with us, the look at which schools and the rates of graduation. So we further have to lean in and not only say, okay, so what's the root cause analysis? Why does school A have a graduation rate that's 85%, where school B has a graduation rate of 41%? And is it because they're the practices of the teachers or the administration, or is it that they don't have access to certain materials? Like, we have to really lean in hard to try and figure that out. And as Jackie says, then we have to equalize that, and we have to make sure that the students are getting the resources, that if it's professional development or training, or if we have to look at attitudes and beliefs relative to expectations of our scholars, that has to be addressed. But that's why, you have the data aspect of that, and then you have to lean in and really figure out what exactly is going on. And then we have to address it. We can't just, I love the saying, too many times in education, we admire the problem. We're like, oh, goodness, this is a problem. This is bad. This is really bad, right? But then we don't do anything about it. So we're looking through task forces on the district side, and Rock the Future has subcommittees as well. We're going to work and really converge on stop admiring the problem and actually start fixing it and addressing it. And so that's going to be critical work that we do, remote or in person. We've got to really lean in on this, and we've got to start putting our noses to the grindstone on this and fix it.
Evan, if I may, I just want to jump on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Wade.
Thank you very much. And I want to also say how incredibly grateful I am to be in the company of these two very brilliant people. And hopefully I will keep the standard that they're trying to set. And I want to go back to one of the comments that you made earlier, Evan, in terms of what Don Berwick from the Institute of Healthcare Improvement called the second law of healthcare improvement. And that is that every system achieves the results that it is designed to achieve. And I think we need to really reflect on the fact that what we see as the opportunity gap, what we measure and see as differences in educational outcomes by race and class, really are in many ways design features and not design glitches. let us remember that we have been on a decades-long journey as a country, thinking that education is a commodity, that it is something that you can so easily reduce to a quantifiable number. And we can publish it in newspaper inserts that were really paid for by the real estate industry here in Rochester, New York. I remember those grading our school inserts that came with the daily paper. And that we could reduce education down to these numbers that are really blind to the fact that Mrs. Roosevelt was right, that the giving of love is an essential ingredient of education itself. And this morning's news reports to simply reduce the very thoughtful work that's been going on in this community by distinguished monitors working with the superintendent to say, here are real things that need to be fixed. That, my God, the computer information system is outdated. And the superintendent is looking for that to be treated as a priority. And all we do is reduce it down to class size and money. Shame on us. Shame on us. The only path to achieving educational equity, to making sure that our children have pathways to college, career, and community readiness, is by addressing crime, safety, health, racism, and poverty. Those things are necessary ingredients, and that's the conversation that I believe we're having here today. And I hope everybody who logged in or everybody who heard of it understood the title, Where Do We Go From Here? Is only one question of Dr. King's seminal work of more than 50 years ago. The other question was chaos or community. And I dare say it is time for us to stop engaging in chaos, and it is time for us to start engaging in community. And I am here because I believe that Rock the Future can be that community conversation. It can be that table that serves education the way in which we aim every day at Common Ground Health to serve the health community.
And Evan, if I could just jump in here and just say that part of what Wade, you know, I started rocking back and forth because this is what we do in church. But when we're getting excited about what's being given to us, and the other piece of this is the community of parents and families, and so part of the democratic process. I'm a brand new citizen, by the way, voted for the first time this year. But part of the democratic process for us is, how do we lift our own voice to be a part of the conversation, to get what it is that we need for ourselves. And so it has been amazing to me that when I have been talking to parents and families around this same issue that you're talking about, Wade, in terms of the system, how the system is actually built, whose voice matters and whose doesn't, that parents are getting it. So like we've sort of put this, the idea of equity in a space where only certain people discuss it. And that's wrong. That does not help build our community. And so part of what we're seeing and what we need to do is, how do we bring parents and families, those who have ultimate responsibility for their students, how do they lead? How do we help them lead? Because they should be also demanding what it is necessary for their students. When Leslie, you were mentioning when you went to the U of R in terms of the first course that you took, my first course was at MCC, and it was a African American literature course. I never even knew about African American literature until I actually got there. So I have a very different lens, but thank God for that course at MCC, right? That sort of started me years ago on a very different trajectory. Our families are saying, what else do we need? What information have we not received? And part of this is how we provide that for them so that they actually come to the table and are partnered with us. So I wanted to just make sure I put that in there, because too often we have conversations like it's someone else's responsibility. And actually it's all of us, and including especially our parents and families.
Well, on the subject of where we go from here, I've been in Rochester for 2 decades, and there have been many proposals about schools, magnet schools, sort of changing up the districts. And I want to go to a question that comes from Dan Dermasic, who's watching now. And Dan says the following: given the benefits of school integration for both students of color and white students, and the negative impacts of racial segregation, according to Rucker Johnson in his book, Children of the Dream, what efforts should be made to initiate more racial integration within Monroe County? I'll start with Dr. Myers-Small on that.
I am waiting for this question. Thank you, Evan. So just context, I think most people know that this is not my first superintendency, that I spent almost 8 years in Brockport Central School District as superintendent, and was very proud to have the urban suburban program. It's one of the longest running programs after West Irondequoit, because of the benefit of, as far as cultural, racial diversity in the district. Now shifting in this seat, I'm getting a little tired of hearing that my students need to leave Rochester and go to another suburban school district in order to get a quality education, right? So that's on me and my team to make sure that we are rising that tide, and the tide is bringing up all the ships. But what I would like to see is that white students come into Rochester schools, and we work on bringing more students into the city. And I'm familiar with, with Great Schools for All. I am very familiar with that work. And also that the suburban to urban program is non-existent. Really, there aren't many suburban students coming into the city. But why can't we take some of our schools and have a particular focus and emphasis? So in my perfect world, Evan, I would love to see a school of social justice policy and advocacy in the city, where we have suburban students coming in and working with our Rochester City School District students. And they can govern, they can set the policy, the regulations, they can work on advocacy, they can let me know things that they need as the superintendent here or the Board of Education. But the answer is always drain the Rochester City School District and send them out to the suburbs. And again, I know we unfortunately have not always had a history of being academically successful. And so again, we're working on that and bringing that up. But I would love to see more schools, if we're going to talk about integrating our schools and having more racial integration and even socioeconomic integration, I'd love to see white students or suburban white students coming into the city, and we having a particular theme or magnet happen. That's what I would like to see. But the answer is always, we need to send the students out of the city into the suburbs. And I think we need to shift that paradigm.
All right, let me ask Wade Norwood the same question.
I'm sorry, it took me a while to find the unmute button. I think that the question that Dan asked is phrased in the right way. Because the fact that I think that we who tend to think in this space overestimate the cumulative failure of our educational process. Most adults do not understand that the science is clear, that our children have a greater toolkit for success by learning in integrated, diverse, and creation and language-rich environments. This is not a conversation about charity for our little brown brothers and sisters. This is an urgent, compelling need for children who are growing up suffering from suburban affluenza. when our children reach the real world of college, career, and community, if they cannot navigate in spaces and in places with people who do not look like them, we are going to lose our democracy. Ben Franklin said, I think we have a democracy if we can keep it. We're not even teaching that. And what we need to do is we need to start, and I think the 21-day challenge from the United Way did this fantastically. And I have talked with lots of African Americans who said to me, why are they doing this? This is, everybody knows this. This is BS, blah, 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 blah. And I've said to them, you know, I have never seen this curriculum in writing. I've never seen it sent to more than 100,000 people in our community. That's just about the size of our voting electorate. It is absolutely powerful what happens when we as a community commit to say, here's something we think every thinking adult should understand. And I would say, Jackie, Rock the Future ought to put together 50 reasons why Brown v. Board was right. Separate but unequal, hurts Black children, hurts white children, and hurts every other group within our community. And I think if we did that, then the next step to answer Dan's question is we really need to start looking at our housing practices. And we really need to understand what they just did out at Del Largo Casino. Because that casino needed workers. What they did was they provided affordable housing right next to the casino. It utterly has changed the student population in the community. But we don't think as community about the people who work and create the tax-based wealth that's drawn from the commercial activity and the sales tax transactions. And this pandemic, my mother is right. It has been a blessing according to the universe's will, because we are learning now how much we value those people. We are learning that they truly are essential workers. And so maybe one of the things we ought to do is start doing what New Zealand did, which is say we need to solve the equity gap in pay, and New Zealand's government is paying to make sure those people have a sustainable wage. They're not counting on the employers to do it. The taxpayers are saying we're going to do it because we believe that anybody who works a full week's worth of work ought not be living in poverty. And just as in health, the surest way to improvement is to improve household income, I believe the same thing is true in education. We improved household income, we would see different outcomes, because Jackie said earlier, education isn't equivalent to schooling. Schooling's a big part of education, but education was also the field trips I took my children to, the trips to the museum. It was my ability to buy them books and magazines. There are many things that parents of limited means are limited in doing. And I think if we were investing in those things, first of all, raising our consciousness and our cognition, and then secondly, making sure that everybody is out of survival mode, then I think we could begin having the conversation about how do we get a more integrated system of schools. Because only then can you have people at the stage of imagination. I'm a Star Trekker, so I'll say that to be able to do a Kobayashi Maru, okay? That's where in the training exercise for Starfleet Academy, Captain Kirk realized it was a no-win situation, so he flipped the script. He changed the rules. If you had asked me back in January, Wade Norwood, would you be an effective worker sitting at home staring at your computer all day? I'd say no way. If you had asked me in January, Pastor Norwood, can you have a church worship your God in spirit and in truth by computer? I'd say no way. Guess what? I'm doing it in both realms. I don't think we should be lost in trying to figure out what the structure looks like, because none of us know tomorrow. What we ought to be doing is having the conversation about what do we believe in? What are the values we share? And what are the unnegotiables that we're going to demand for all the children in our community? If we did that, that would be the first step, the second step, and the third step. And by taking those 3 steps, we'd be able to say, as Susan B. Anthony, failure is impossible.
Yeah, as I send it over to Jackie, Wade mentioned Brown v. Board. This is another good example, I think, of where teaching and history falls a little short. If I'm remembering correctly, I hope I don't get this wrong, but I think the majority opinion, the justice who wrote it, said essentially it was the right decision for wrong and racist reasons, saying that, well, black children need to be among white children to succeed. When no, I can tell you as a white parent of an 8-year-old, and I live in the city of Rochester, I am always thinking about the ways that he might be missing out on education in sort of the kind of schooling that I grew up with. And again, not to malign the schools I grew up with, but I take Wade's point and Dr. Myers-Small really, really keenly on that. And Jackie, I'll send it over to you if you want to add to some of what you've heard from him.
I would also add one of the things that struck me by the impact of Brown versus Board of Education is the reduction in Black educators. And so as we start to think about what it is that where we want to go and integrating our schools, we also have to talk about integration across the spectrum. So also with our educator workforce. And I will also say that I'm learning and I'm having some hard conversations with myself. And part of the challenge around integration is, as I look at the data, at a certain point, we had this exodus of white flight to the suburbs. And what you have to really ask parents, and overwhelmingly in the school district, those are parents of color, is what does that mean for you and for your children? And how can we help? How can we help your understanding of that, but also so that you have input in terms of that, right? Because in one aspect, it might seem like, to Leslie's point, when we're talking about integration, we're really talking about chasing Black and brown people, chasing white students all over the county, as opposed to we are here, right? And we're here with open arms. Our schools, we actually, I believe the data that kids do better when they learn from each other. But we also have to be sure that we're lifting a culturally responsive curriculum so that we're helping students to actually see themselves, so that it's relevant to who they are. Whatever they're learning is relevant to who they are right now, so that they can make the decisions that they need to make. What would it be for a high school junior or a high school senior to really exit school and not having talked about some of the racial issues that we're having that are going on right now, and how it relates to them right now in their lived experience, and how it can inform where they need to go in their future? To not be able to bring that kind of deliberate cultural introspection and pedagogy to what students are learning, wherever they are sitting, is a failure, an epic failure for our future generations. And so when I think about integration, absolutely, the world is smaller than it used to be. And so how are we preparing our workforce, our younger, our young scholars, to be a part of that workforce, but not just to be a part of that workforce, to actually lead? So integration, yes, but I also say integration across the whole spectrum.
Briefly, before I ask all of you to offer some closing thoughts, I just want to ask Wade a little bit about my understanding, Wade, and correct me if I'm wrong, New York State Regents canceled plans for exams in January, and there's going to be questions about how students are going to be assessed and whether there can be equitable assessment during a pandemic. How do you see that, Wade?
I think without a doubt, that is the most serious and pressing question that faces us as we deal with our, unfortunately, capital A accountability system. It should be a little a accountability, because of the fact that I am very concerned about how it is we will be able to guarantee that there is a identical offering across the entirety of the state. So I'm gonna just say it is under advisement. It is being very seriously considered by the department staff, and I anticipate comment to come into public space before the Board of Regents at some point in the next 45 days.
Dr. Myers-Small, you want to add to that? Any thoughts on how students are assessed and any concerns or thoughts you have on that?
You know, that's something that we're looking at right now. And Wade mentioned Dr. Kara Finnegan, who's a thought partner of mine. And we just met on Saturday online, and we talked about what are ways that we can really thoroughly assess how students, what they know and are able to do online, right? Because we're looking at everything from our first 10 weeks just ended. We can look at how they did numerically or grade-wise now and what was it a year ago, but you're really comparing apples to nails, right? You're not even comparing apples to oranges because there is so much more that's involved. So we're working with the University of Rochester to see, because colleges and universities have done online learning much longer than we have at the pre-K-12 sector. So we are looking to see what are ways that we can assess what students know and don't know. It's still early, but I agree. We're looking to see what exactly that entails and how we can do some meaningful measurement.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and my goodness, the hour has gone quickly. And I'm going to ask all of you a couple of minutes apiece if you want to share some final thoughts that you want to make sure the viewing audience keeps with them as we think about equity. We think about ways to create a much more effective path forward, and the ways that, frankly, this country has not just entrenched, but as our guests have been talking about, intentionally entrenched this, and how to change that. Dr. Myers-Small, I'll ask you to start.
Thank you. I want to start with this quote that I found many years ago, and it says, "I'm asking you to imagine what it must be like to experience inequality every single day in ways that are sometimes small or subtle, or other ways that are sometimes overt, direct, and certainly unjust and unjust." And so I think that's the perspective that we have to take. Too many of us have been lulled into complacency that, well, this doesn't matter to me because I haven't been treated poorly, or I don't have any touch points with this. I think where we are contemporarily, given what we're seeing that's happened at the White House, what's happening in our nation across cities large and small, if we don't start paying attention to racism and anti-racism and inequality, our children are leading the way. We're seeing just a new generation of leaders where, if you watched the film roll right from the protesting, there were many young people, and they weren't just high schoolers. We had middle school students and elementary students who were actively involved in these protests. And they were not just Rochester City School District students. They attended Rush Henrietta and Spencerport and Pittsford and et cetera. And so we have to, as adults, we have to walk away from the fact that we are the only ones who know this and get it and understand it. Maybe we've been dealing with it a little bit longer or a lot longer, but our young people are leading the way. I would love, Evan, to bring a group of my scholars that are on the Student Leadership Congress, and for you to talk to them. They blow me away every time I'm with them. And I'm not surprised, and that sometimes is a microaggression with, oh my gosh, your students are so articulate. No, they are incredible. They are bright, they're bold, they're passionate. And we have to really start listening to the children. And I'll leave it with this. May Whitney Houston continue to rest in peace. She sang "The Greatest Love of All," but there's one line that always got on my nerves, where she said, I believe the children are our future. We have to operate from the premise that they're our present. And once we start doing that, things are going to change.
They are invited, and I look forward to setting up that conversation, Dr. Myers-Small. That's a beautiful offer. Thank you very much.
Thank
Wade
you.
Norwood, you're next.
Well, since I opened talking about the fact that I just genuinely love Jackie and Leslie and talked about Mrs. Roosevelt and love, I'll end with Dr. King's statement from Where Do We Go From Here, which was about love. And he said, what's needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power is at its best when it is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
You should try preaching sometime, Wade. It could work out for you. Beautiful sentiments there. Jackie Campbell, as I turn it over to you, I just want to remind everyone who's been seeing this or will see it, what a great job Rock the Future has done at staying engaged with the community during these hard circumstances. I know it's not been easy. Your team, Jessica, phenomenal job to make sure that everyone is connected and that these conversations can happen even when we have to be apart. So thank you for that, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Evan. And one, I would just close by saying thank you so much, Dr. Myers-Small, and thank you, Wade, as well as thank you, Evan, for hosting this or emceeing this conversation. This is such a critical issue. When I say this, equity in education, and again, these are the folks who have been thinking long and hard on it. And the whole of State of Our Children Week is what I've been calling it, is focused on making sure that we're sharing information with the community and we're talking about some of the things that are coming up, where we've been, but not only that, where we want to go. So I just really want to thank you both for taking the time. And as well, Evan, this is, I think, maybe your 4th or 5th year with us. And so I'm just really grateful that we have this kind of commitment to our community and to our scholars and to our families. So thank you all.
Evan, we're having a hard time hearing you. You're not coming through if you can hear us. Can't hear you.
That's okay.
Can't hear you. So I'll maybe insert what I think Evan might be saying. Thank you so much for joining Jackie, Wade, and I certainly hope that some of our comments maybe inspired you, but maybe irritated you as well and lit a fire under you. We come at this work certainly from different perspectives, but we really do have one vision, one voice, and that's really a focus on our children in the Rochester community. We thank you for your time today. Thank you for the sponsors who participated in making this happen. And Jackie, thank you for your leadership. And Wade, thank you so much for your support of not only Rochester, but students across the state of New York.
Yeah. And
Thank you, Leslie.
I just wanted to say,
go ahead. You're going to tee up tomorrow?
Tomorrow we have the CEO of Strive Together, which is the network that we belong to, the national network we belong to. She's going to be our keynote tomorrow. She is excellent and passionate about this work and is really leading almost 70 communities across the country to really think hard around racial equity and doing what we can on the ground to shift things. That's tomorrow, Jennifer Blatz at 11 a.m. Please join us for that. It's going to be really exciting to close out our show. And I do want to thank Jessica and Ryan, they've just been killing it. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah. Woo! Thank you, Evan.
Whoop, whoop.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.